This meeting is being recorded.
Today we are going to be discussing Module 11 from the Clinician's Handbook for OCD by Kieran O'Connor and Frederick Ardema. And Module 11 is on the real self, and Kate Goldhouse is going to present for us today. Kate is an LCSW and has her own private practice, Catherine Goldhouse Psychotherapy, in Maine, Florida, and Massachusetts. And she also will be leading an upcoming I-CBT training course. So if you are interested in information about that, you can mention it in the chat and I can get a link to you. So we really appreciate her. She's presented a couple of times for us and we're glad to have her back today. Kate, are you ready if I go ahead and just turn it over to you?
I am, yes.
Awesome.
Okay, screen share advanced. Screen. Okay. So can you see that?
Yes.
Okay. Alrighty. So the real self. I would say the real self, inferential confusion, and the story are like what I consider the three main components of I-CBT. So yeah, let's get started. So I always like to start with a quote. Oops, sorry. Okay. An identity would seem to be arrived at by the way in which the person faces and uses his experience, by James Baldwin. So in order to understand this concept of the real self, it's important to get clear on two other concepts. The first is the false self, and the other is the narrative. For what it's worth, I've found using false self or feared self to be preferable to vulnerable self or even vulnerable self theme, because vulnerability is like very in right now. And so people are quick to assume that you're saying it's an actual part of themselves, which obviously we want them to get away from, because the vulnerable self, you know, the feared self, it doesn't exist. So our goal is to help people see that they have been living in fear of a version of themselves that only exists in their imagination and has no basis in reality. So to recap briefly the false self, people with OCD often have self-doubt and struggle to trust themselves or even know who they really are. This makes them especially susceptible to believing that imagined versions of themselves that they would never want to be could actually be who they really are or could one day become. In fact, compulsions, including avoiding, ruminating, researching, and replaying, are about making sure this feared imaginary self did not, does not, and or will not come true. So why does this matter? Because you only have doubts that are obsessional when they relate to your feared self. No feared self, no obsessional doubt. So last time I presented, I covered Module 9 on the alternative or the new story. And the point I tried to get across was that we carry stories with us all the time. And these stories filter how we see the world and interpret events. In other words, our stories determine how we make inferences. So if we change our stories, then we change our inferences. And inferences are where doubts begin. So if our inferences are determined by our narrative, our reasonable next question would be, what determines our narrative? So I posted this on Facebook shortly after my presentation on the alternative story, and I'm just going to review what it says. So think of the OCD story as a spell that has been cast upon you, making you believe something that is not true. When the spell is broken, you realize all your compulsions were made under the influence of this spell, and so the conclusions become meaningless. Let's pretend you are under a spell that causes you to believe you are sick. This would mean that when the spell is broken, you would no longer believe you are sick. Instead, you would believe you are healthy. When creating the alternative story, you are writing as if the spell were broken. So in this case, it would be from the perspective of a healthy person. If you still believe you might be sick and write a story about how it won't be so bad, then you aren't writing as if the spell is truly broken. When the spell breaks, you will see reality in a whole new light. When writing your alternative story, it can be helpful to ask, is this the story of someone no longer under the spell? Or is this the story of someone still under the spell and trying to manage as best they can? So I provided two different examples. And I want to clarify this, A, because it's relevant to what I'm presenting today, but also B, because several people reached out and gave me, asked me about people they are working with. And there was a lot of kind of making it so that, yes, this could happen, but it wouldn't be so bad. Or I could handle it. And we want to create a different bridge, right? You're still bridging that same outcome, and we want to create a different bridge. So an example of what you don't want to do would be, I go to the doctor and get infected by someone else's germs left over in the exam room. So let's say that's the feared outcome. But my immune system is strong, and so I'm able to fight off the disease. I also have excellent health insurance, and so I would get the best medical care available. So that's still buying into the story, right? It's still buying into something for which there is no evidence. An example where the spell is broken would be, I go to the doctor's office and sit in the exam room. It's lovely and incredibly clean. My gown is freshly laundered, and I feel comfortable sitting in the exam chair. I feel that I'm in good hands with a doctor who has staff that prioritizes cleanliness and safety. You'll notice that breaking the spell doesn't just allow someone to see something differently and develop a new narrative. What also changes is the view this person has of themselves. You can't really have one without the other. To change the narrative without changing the view of the self isn't going to make the new narrative very convincing. So here's an example of what that looks like. You have the narrative, something terrible is going to happen to my family, and that leads to the inference, my mom is not home, which means she was probably kidnapped. Okay, so someone who had the self story of like, things are okay, I'm safe, the people I love are present and with me, like they're not going to have this type of narrative going on. But someone who has the self story of, I am someone who always loses those whom she loves, it would make sense why this narrative would develop, and that would kind of lead to this inference. So now we will find out who you really are. It is recommended in the manual that we introduce this topic this way. So how does one do this? Who are we anyway? What is self? Don't do what I did a few months ago and like get bogged down by philosophical questions about the concept of self. It like will get you nowhere. I mean, in terms of I-CBT, for what matters for the sake of this presentation anyway, is how I-CBT conceptualizes the self. Unfortunately, it is rather simple. In I-CBT, the self is the you that shows up in reality. That is, quote, what we think and do in everyday life. And the way we figure this out is to observe what we think and do in everyday life. So there are several different exercises to help clients see this. I'm going to share just a few that I like and have found helpful. These come from the clinician's handbook, Beyond Reasonable Doubt, and then some of them I made up. So this one, I think is great. So you compare stories. So you would instruct the client to do this. So start by spelling out your feared self and all the things the OCD says you really are or could be. This would be in the form of, I'm the sort of person who could be, blah, 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 blah. Expand as much as possible on all the decisions why you could be the type of person as dictated by your OCD. After you've written down this story about who the OCD says you could be, write a second story. What? Did someone say something? Oh, okay. Write a second story, but this time write down the reasons that show this story is about, write down the reasons that show this story about you is unfounded. For example, if you wrote down in the previous story, I'm the sort of person who could hurt others, then in the second story, you would write down, I'm the sort of person who is kind and considerate to others. Basically, for each reason you wrote down in the first story about why you are one sort of person, then write another reason in the second story about why you are not that type of person. Then put both stories next to each other and look at them with your common sense. Which of the two stories most resonates with you when looking at it calmly? In all likelihood, the alternative story is likely to be far more accurate because you have come up with counterexamples that come from real life in the second story, whereas in the first, you were drawing from hypotheticals and possibilities. And then you would discuss this with your therapist. So sometimes clients come in not just with a feared self that they think they are vulnerable to becoming, but also an ideal self that is impossible to live up to. And of course, they feel like they're not living up to that. And we don't want clients to feel that we expect them to describe themselves as the ideal versions of themselves because they don't believe that's what they are anyway. And so encouraging them to see something that isn't really there is exactly what we are trying to avoid. So we really want to look at the observable experiences of every day. So here are some prompts that are from the Clinician's Handbook. So, do you wait in line? Have you opened the door for someone? Do you offer to help? Do you keep your word? Do you have friends and are you kind to them? Do you appreciate good food? The answers to these kinds of questions can be very revealing. If you wait in line, then we can infer you are a patient person. If you open doors, you are a polite person. If you sometimes forget dates or jobs, then you are just like anyone else. It can be helpful to then take these attributes and have clients write an autobiography recounting in particular how these attributes have helped them in life. And then to describe future goals and plans from the perspective of this authentic self. So for those of you familiar with narrative therapy, a lot of my training is in narrative therapy. So this is very narrative therapy-esque, but you can ask a client to describe a story, any story from their real life. It could be sort of, you know, yesterday I picked up my kid from school or whatever, or it could be something more significant. And as they're telling this story, you want to kind of interject and ask them, okay, in that moment, wait, tell me, what was meaningful for you in that moment? And that can really help clients see that much of their true selves and values show up in their daily actions. There we go. Okay. The handbook also talks about reconnecting with feelings and how important that is to reconnect with one's real self. We often hear from our clients that they don't know what they really want or how they really feel. All the self-doubting makes it very difficult to feel grounded and trust those wants and feelings to be real. Or they'll get confused with which feelings and wants are real and which are not. When clients are in this place of, I don't even know anything anymore, I always ask, well, what can you say you know for sure? It's a great way to bring people back to the here and now and remind them that there is a part of them that is knowing and clear. Also, feelings like hunger, warmth, having to pee, being thirsty, those are all good go-tos. Most people will say like, yeah, I know when I have to pee. And that can kind of help them realize like, oh yeah, there is part of myself that I can have, that I can trust. And so having them be aware of these things and know that they are aware of them can help give them confidence and self-trust to progress to detecting more complex feelings and sensations. So lastly, don't be afraid to ask your clients questions to elaborate on stories you've heard them tell before. to help them see their real self. For example, I have a client who is obsessed with the doubt that she might not be living authentically. This causes her to constantly ruminate about every single choice and whether the choice was authentic or not. Meanwhile, she has made some choices that go against the grain, choices that you'd only make because that's what you really wanted. So I started asking her to tell me about making some of those choices. Asking lots of questions and giving this airtime was very, very helpful. Keep in mind, the self story is still a story. And the more airtime you give to that one particular bridge, the more solid and ingrained it becomes at the expense of other bridges. So in the manual, clients are ready to proceed to the next step when the client has listed and recognized authentic positive attributes of self and identified authentic self feelings. The client has realized that the authentic self is different from the attributes of the self that the OCD was saying he or she would become. And the client has at least accepted the need to reposition themselves toward the world based on seeing and planning projects in the light of the authentic self. So lastly, I wanted to leave you all with this point. In working with clients to create alternative stories, we help them to see that their current OCD story is just a story, just like the alternative story is just a story, that it's all stories, but some stories are based more on the imagination and others are based more on reality. They get to choose which one to be the narrative they carry. This is just the same as it is for stories about ourselves. You can connect dots in many different ways. So why not connect the dots that best reflect the reality of who you are in the here and now, rather than the completely imagined hypothetical version for which there is no evidence. Alrighty. So that is it. Trying to figure out how to, there we go. Alrighty. Questions, comments, concerns?
Thank you very much, Kate. That was really awesome and helpful. And I know, I'm just thinking about how powerful that last slide was with the connecting the different colored dots. Like, I know you used that before and I don't think I got it. And then now I'm realizing that you can pick out all these different pieces of information to follow a totally different line and have a totally different story that makes a totally different picture. So that's really cool. I like that image.
Oh, good.
I think you said you created it yourself.
Yeah, and it took so long.
It's good. I'll start off questions because I have one. And then other people can also follow. But I'm wondering if you or anyone can speak to the trying to decide whether to do the authentic self hand in hand following the OCD story, like one right after the other or at the same time. I'm thinking of the video where, if I remember correctly, the Natalia video in that series of sessions, they seem to do this more hand in hand, whereas in the manual, these sessions are spread with other sessions in between.
Yeah, that's a good question. So in designing the curriculum for this course, I'm really trying to design it in a way that's like, okay, how do I wish that, how did I make sense of it for myself? And I really do see these things as almost one and the same. And so I'm going to be presenting them together because separating them in some way, it's sort of an artificial separation because, like I said, it is still a story, right? Like the story of Kate as therapist, that's a story. I could equally come up with Kate as Californian living in New England and, however that would go. So they can be presented separately, like how they are in the manual. I think, I mean, of course, there's time constraints, but I think presenting them as one and the same could work really well. At the same time, the one caveat to that is like the self story may create a bunch of different stories, whereas the narrative isn't going to create a bunch of different selves, if that makes sense. So like the root ultimately is the self story, as opposed to the narrative. Does that make